My name is Samantha, and I'm 28 years old. In this house full of memories and many shadows of the past, I live alone, despite the fact that physically my parents are still here. They are like transparent figures, flashing past me and absorbed in their worries. The long hours of their absence during the day and my loneliness at home became part of my reality, as if it had always been so. My older sister Madison used to be around, but 2 years ago she got married and left, leaving behind only her always arrogant look and the feeling that I was something insignificant to her. My home is a refuge where the familiar world is limited to the walls of my room, illuminated only by a computer screen shining in the evening silence. This is where my passion for technology began. I was only 14 years old when my grandfather, the only one who sincerely believed in my abilities, gave me a computer. I still remember how tremulously I unpacked it. My fingers trembled slightly, feeling the cold case. It was not just a gift, but a symbol of faith and trust. The computer turned out to be my friend and guide to a world where I could create something of my own, where I could escape from the indifference of my parents and the arrogant attitude of my sister. Grandpa is gone now. He left 3 years ago, and with him disappeared someone who was not just a close person for me, but also a bright source of support and acceptance. After he left, I became even more withdrawn, as if my soul had plunged into silence, diluted only by the sound of keys and the light of the monitor. My parents did not understand my work, considering it a game, an empty entertainment. In their eyes, I remained a recluse, stuck in my virtual world, in which, as they believed, there was nothing real. Even Madison, bright and successful in the eyes of her parents, could not hide her contempt, looking at my hobbies as something frivolous and incomprehensible. It always seemed to me that my desire for computers had become a quiet but decisive response to their indifference, a way to build my own world where my actions and successes mattered more than their attitude. Now the same computer has been preserved in my room, already updated, but still filled with memories and the joy of the first discoveries. My job turned into an online business, which allowed me to gain financial independence and not depend on the opinion of my parents. In this house, in my small space, I found freedom. However, I have never been able to truly hate my parents, despite all their coldness. Deep down, I felt that maybe they just didn't know how to show their love, how to support me in something they didn't understand themselves. Maybe they lacked the sensitivity and care that my grandparents gave me so generously. Sunday morning was still as quiet as ever. I had already prepared breakfast and set the plates in the kitchen so that my parents could eat in peace while I was doing work. At that moment, the door to my room suddenly opened, and Mom, glancing at me, asked if breakfast was ready. I nodded, noting that everything was on the table and waiting. Since my grandfather left, most of the household duties have been transferred to me, as if this was natural for me, as if working from home automatically turned me into a person free for everything that my parents would like to entrust to me. "Have you seen your father by any chance?" Mom added, almost absently. "He left early this morning again." I shrugged, surprised at her question. Lately, Dad has really started to leave early on weekends, disappearing into the foggy morning, as if fleeing from something. I remembered how long I hadn't talked to Dad, and it felt a little strange. Since high school, our conversations have increasingly been reduced to casual exchanges of a few words. In recent years, he has become a ghostly figure in my life, almost like a stranger who happens to live in the same house. Meanwhile, Mom continued her morning chores and reminded me that Madison and her family would arrive around noon today. I couldn't help but feel a shadow of confusion. Madison, my older sister. Sometimes it seemed to me that she was not part of our family at all, but some episode from a previous life, from my youth, to which I had long lost access. And now she will appear again on the threshold of our house, as if she had descended from the paintings of the past, so alien and distant. "You'll probably be surprised that she finally decided to visit us," Mom said, coming closer and raising an eyebrow. "It's been so long since you've seen each other, right?" I nodded, realizing how true that sounded. After her marriage, Madison rarely showed up here, except to meet her parents somewhere in the city. Even when she found out she was expecting a baby, she didn't come home. Mom and Dad, on the contrary, immediately rushed to her, proud of her happiness and new status in her life. But now she's coming back, she's expressed a desire. It had to mean something. She said she had important news, Mom continued, clearly hiding her slight excitement, and since she's coming back after such a long time, I want everything to be perfect. Make a nice lunch, okay? I nodded, understanding her expectations, and sighed inwardly. Even if I wanted to change something in our relationship with my sister, her past cold attitude left a mark that was difficult to forget. I knew that no matter how much I wanted to talk to my nephew, this feeling of detachment would not go away in one meal. But I was expected to accept her return as something meaningful. However, there were problems besides internal unrest. I had almost no money to buy groceries this month. My business had generated little income in recent weeks, and I could already feel my mom's gaze on me, annoyed and judging me for just playing games, as she put it. Her attitude seemed especially harsh in recent months. Every time I asked for some money for help around the house, her displeasure turned into rudeness. I cautiously turned to her for money for groceries. But her response was, as always, exasperated. Didn't you get them from your father? He told me that he had already given them to you, Mom said sharply, without even looking at me. I knew that he hadn't given me the full amount last month, and apparently he was sure that Mom would take care of him. I need everything for this month, Mom, I said quietly, trying to contain my irritation. But without even deigning to pay me the full amount, Mom threw $30 on the table. If you worked properly, this wouldn't be happening, she said, brushing crumbs off the table. How long are you going to play these games? You're just wasting your time. I told you it was a job, I replied stiffly, holding back my rising irritation. Mom interrupted me, continuing to speak in her cold tone. Don't talk to me about work until you can live on your own. It's not life to depend on your parents for pocket money, she added. I would like to object, to remind you exactly how my business helps us, about the care that I take in the house, about all the things that I took over after my grandfather's death. But her misunderstanding hung between us like a heavy barrier that neither love nor respect could break through. After finishing her words, she abruptly closed the door and left, leaving behind a feeling of cold and discomfort. Taking a deep breath, I returned to work, but the silence of the house, previously cozy, now pressed down like something alien and hostile. As soon as I completed the necessary tasks, I decided to go shopping so that I could be back by noon, when Madison was supposed to arrive. When I returned home after a quick shopping, I immediately set about preparing lunch. The smell of fresh vegetables and seasonings was in the kitchen, the frying pan was sizzling softly, and I was concentrating on the dish, trying to do everything at the highest level. Mom, taking her usual place in front of the TV, enjoyed the relaxing silence, preparing for the arrival of her long-awaited daughter, and the father returned a few minutes before noon, looked a little tired and, as usual, restrained. When the doorbell rang, I noticed Mom's face instantly brightened up, as if she had shed years. She hurried to the door, and her voice, cheerful and welcoming, echoed through the house. Oh, Madison. What a joy that you could come. Come in soon. For a moment, everything froze, as if the very air in the house felt this change, and then Madison came in. In her shiny and immaculately chosen outfit, she looked, as always, unapproachable and slightly arrogant. She was wearing expensive designer clothes, and there was no hint of modesty in her image, bright makeup, perfectly styled hair, and that triumphant light that I remembered well shone in her eyes. She seemed strange and at the same time so familiar. Oh, Samantha, you're still here, she remarked casually, glancing around the room and not even seeming interested in the answer. Madison sat down on the couch with a flourish, not hiding her fatigue. While I was looking for my nephew, whom I hoped my sister had brought, my mother took the baby in her arms. His curious, wide-open eyes looked at everything around with indescribable admiration. Little fingers held tightly to the edge of my mother's dress, and for a moment I felt an involuntary warmth in my chest, watching him. "What are you looking at, Samantha?" "Hurry up and cook dinner," Mom said coldly, noticing that I was frozen, admiring my nephew. Her voice was stern, as if she was returning me to my duties, to what she thought should be my place in this family. Madison, noticing this exchange, smiled with a hint of mockery and, raising one eyebrow, asked, "Mom, are you still making Samantha do all the homework?" "Of course," Mom replied with a light laugh. "All she does is sit in her room all day and play her games. So it wouldn't hurt to get a little help from her. He's just spending money being here." Mom and Madison exchanged glances, and then continued the conversation cheerfully, as if I were something far away, like forgotten responsibilities, but a necessary part of their familiar world. I felt a slight irritation flare up inside me, but decided not to show it. I wanted to somehow establish a conversation with my sister, try to find common ground, ask about her life, maybe understand her a little more. "What about your family life, Madison?" I tried to speak calmly, choosing my words carefully, hoping it would ease the tension. "You probably have a lot of housework to do with the child, don't you?" She grinned as if I'd said something completely ridiculous, and waved her hand lazily. "Oh, I don't do any housework, Samantha. I don't even want to think about it." Her tone was both condescending and frankly pleased. "We have a housekeeper, so I don't have to do any small things." It seemed to me that there was a note of disdain in her words, as if my existence, absorbed in household duties and quiet work, seemed almost pathetic to her. Remembering that her husband is a doctor, I was not surprised why their family could afford a housekeeper. Mom, of course, was delighted with this marriage, in which money and status played an important role. "Oh, it must be really convenient," I said, barely hiding a slight awkwardness. "And the husband is probably often busy?" "Yes, of course," Madison confirmed, rolling her eyes. "He is almost never at home even on weekends. Calls, urgent calls, everything is like all doctors." Our conversation took a deceptively calm turn for a moment, but soon Madison couldn't resist stopping me with a cold expression on her face as I went to the stove to finish cooking dinner. "You have such an easy life, Samantha," she said with a distinct hint of reproach. "Do you understand how hard our parents are trying to somehow support you here? And shouldn't you already realize at your age that Mom doesn't work hard so that you can sit here and play your games?" I, having gained patience, tried to convey to her the very truth that I had to repeat over and over again, as a vow that no one wants to hear. "Madison, I've already told you and Mom many times that I work from home, and that's enough to support myself," I replied, trying not to raise my voice, trying to put confidence into my words. "I really earn money." But there was only skepticism in Madison's eyes, and her grin was barely contained defiance. "If that's true," she shrugged, "then why don't you get out of here and get on with your life? You say you earn money, but it's probably just a little thing, pocket money. You can't even imagine what it means to really fight, like our mom did, so that we grow up and get everything we have. You're just living off her money, Samantha, and it's clear to everyone that you're hiding behind work to avoid real difficulties." Madison's words, steeped in sharpness and contempt, cut through the air like a blade. She didn't believe that I was really working, and probably considered me something of a burden to my parents, a person incapable of independence. "I stayed here not because I can't leave, but because this house is the only thing that connects me with my grandparents, with those precious memories in which I found solace and peace. They were the only people who really saw me, understood and supported me, and it hurt me to hear Madison turn my motives into a pathetic excuse." "This house belonged to my grandparents," I said firmly, not looking away. "It is full of important memories for me. I feel their presence here, and he will always be dear to me. I don't want to leave here." "I can't believe you're clinging to such nonsense," Madison snorted, You're sitting here like you have nowhere else to go. If it were me, I wouldn't stay in this old house. I could barely contain my irritation. The old house? Yes, the house required maintenance, but it was renovated for Grandpa's convenience, and the kitchen, bathroom, and appliances were updated. Here, among these walls, I felt at home. I felt that I was still connected to those who really cared about me. But, probably, for Madison, these walls were devoid of any meaning. Her relationship with her grandparents, although warm, had never been so deep. She lived in her own world, and she had no attachment to home. The best choice for you would probably be to get married successfully, she continued ironically, but you probably can't do it. I noticed how Mom grinned, echoing her words, and added with some malice. In your position, it's really hard to count on anything serious. How can you expect to be able to start a family or show us grandchildren? You're not even trying to live on your own. All that. It's so useless. I tried to keep outwardly calm, although inside everything was boiling from her words. I wanted to explain that marriage or ostentatious wealth have never been the goal of my life, that I prefer quiet independence and a modest existence in my home. But they seemed to drown out my words even before I could utter them. I earn my own living, and that's enough for me, I replied coldly, looking away so as not to meet their derogatory expressions. Marriage is not the only reason for existence, and I do not need handouts. But there was only a slight laugh in response, and my mother, barely holding back a smile, interrupted me. Stop it already, Samantha. Stop lying. My father and I have long been tired of these stories. And then my nephew, who had been sitting quietly in my mother's arms, suddenly began to cry. His thin, trusting voice seemed to soften the silence for a moment. Mom looked at me as if to indicate that I had better get back to my business. I looked away from her, feeling a growing sense of helplessness and vulnerability, and, without saying a word, returned to the kitchen to continue cooking dinner. I spent the rest of the day lost in my own thoughts, realizing that any attempts to explain anything to Madison or Mom would have been in vain. Madison, as usual, behaved arrogantly, but she appreciated my cooking. She ate everything I cooked without leaving a crumb. At dinner, her presence filled the house with a strange tension, as if something disturbing was flickering under the skin. Although I knew that Madison intended to discuss something important, she left in the evening without saying anything. However, I noticed how her gaze lingered on different parts of the house. She looked around the rooms upstairs, lingered for a long time in the bathroom and in the kitchen, as if assessing the changes that we had gradually made since she left. Her attention to detail, however, was alarming, as if she was calculating, pondering, weighing something on an invisible scale. There seemed to be an ulterior motive behind her apparent indifference. But that day she left without leaving any explanation, and I wondered when we would meet next and what my sister was going to discuss. The next morning, while I was busy in the kitchen preparing breakfast, Mom suddenly interrupted my silent morning solitude. Make sure everything is cleaned up by next Sunday, she said with some significance. And dinner should be on the level. Madison, Dylan, and the kids are coming. Her words left me perplexed. They were just here, why would they come again? And why is her husband going to come too? I bombarded my mother with questions, surprised by such a sudden plan. There's nothing to be so surprised about, Mom replied with a slight irritation, as if my surprise was inappropriate. They have something important to talk about. And by the way, this also applies to you, Samantha, so get free this day. I'm just glad to see my grandchildren again. My anxiety began to grow. Madison hasn't shown up here since she got married, and now suddenly she's coming back a week after her last visit, and even with her husband. It seemed extremely strange. I thought about her possible intentions, but I couldn't think of anything definite. On top of that, I accidentally overheard a conversation between Madison and Mom when I thought they thought I wasn't around. Can you believe that the house is registered in Samantha's name? Madison said indignantly. What was Dad thinking? Don't worry, Mom replied softly, and I caught a note of displeasure in her voice. If we explain to Samantha that her duty is to bear everyone's burden, she may be willing to give up the rights to this house herself. After all, it should belong to us. Their words echoed in my head, raising a painful tangle of feelings in my soul. It turns out they thought I had no right to stay in this house. What was the only support and shelter turned into a stumbling block for them, and they considered me only a temporary shadow that could be easily removed. These thoughts have been haunting me for several days. I tried to focus on my work, immersing myself in each task, as if in a saving silence, but the oppressive feelings did not leave me. It seemed that I was walking on shaky sand, expecting at any moment that the ground would give way under my feet. And so Sunday came. The hours passed slowly, as if time did not want to bring the meeting with Madison and her husband any closer. I saw Dylan for the first time at their wedding. A handsome, personable man, he turned out to be a doctor who decided to follow in his father's footsteps. When Dylan appeared on the doorstep with Madison and their baby, I felt a slight chill run down my spine. I remembered his impassive face at the wedding, beautiful, but detached, as if his thoughts were always somewhere in another space. His mother greeted him with the cordiality inherent in her only in rare moments of approval, which she did not give to everyone. Dylan was the right match for her daughter, the son of a doctor, successful and respected. However, from that day on, he no longer appeared in our house and did not seek to maintain relations with our family. Seeing him now, 2 years later, was strange and disturbing. When I set the table and invited them to dinner, my gaze lingered on Dylan again. He looked tired, even a little haggard, and his quiet, almost imperceptible figure seemed like a blur next to Madison's energy and bombast. They sat down at the table, and I was about to leave for the kitchen when suddenly Madison followed me. "Did you buy these side dishes somewhere in the supermarket?" "What is it?" she asked with a slight hint of condescension. "I wonder if they will suit our taste. We are used to quality food." For a moment I felt annoyed, but I restrained myself, looking at my sister with a slight grin. "I made this dish myself," I replied calmly. "Grandma taught me this recipe, so you don't have to worry about its quality." Madison's face contorted with displeasure for a moment, but she quickly assumed the impeccable look of a caring wife and, nodding, began to serve plates. During dinner, Madison talked mostly about the baby, with undisguised superiority in every word. She proudly told how her son was different from other children, how fast he was developing and how special he was. It was a typical demonstration of her imaginary ideal world, and I could only watch this performance in silence. Dylan remained in the shadows, barely uttering a word. He seemed distant, his gaze was distracted, and even on Madison's story he reacted with barely noticeable nods, as if mentally he was somewhere very far away. And then Madison, continuing her line of bragging, suddenly turned to her mother, smiling slyly. "Seeing what a wonderful child we have, wouldn't you like another grandson?" Then she gave me a malicious, almost contemptuous look, in which I read the same old reproach that I had heard more than once. Her words were carefully chosen to hit me in the most painful spot. "We could already have another grandson," Mom remarked, looking at me reproachfully, "but that's impossible, because Samantha isn't even married. After all, before thinking about children, you need to find yourself a decent husband, right? And if you sit in your room all the time and play your games, how can you even get to know someone? And besides, you're unemployed and you still live in this house." I felt these words sink like a heavy weight, painful and humiliating, and at the same time, stubborn resistance was growing inside me. I took a few deep breaths so as not to betray the surging emotions, and, without responding to the injections, silently finished my dinner. When I was done, I gathered my utensils and prepared to get up from the table to leave the room, but then my mother's voice stopped me, full of hidden anger and determination. "Don't you dare leave," she said in a tone she rarely allowed herself to use. "We're not done yet. We have an important conversation to have, so sit down and listen." I involuntarily froze and took my seat again, feeling my excitement grow. Mom exchanged a glance with Madison, who waited for a pause and said, without hiding her condescension, "Let's get down to business, Samantha. Can you leave this house?" I was silent, staring at her in confusion. I didn't expect to hear such words in any way, and it took me a few seconds to realize their meaning. Madison continued with the same intonation, as if she was talking about a favor that I should do first of all to myself. "Just try to live on your own for once. Dad and Mom are on edge because of you. They're tired of seeing that you don't change anything in your life." Madison's words, her insistence that I should leave the house and start living on my own, sounded almost like an order, covered with feigned concern. She said them with the same arrogant air that one usually throws out casual advice when one is really not interested in the fate of another person. "You have to understand, Samantha," she began, as if she were revealing the truth of life to me. "It's disappointing to see you here when you should have already learned how to earn and live on your own. A little harsh reality will do you good." A wave of anger was rising inside me, hot and fast. I, restraining the tremor in my voice, interrupted her. "How many times do I have to tell you that I work and earn money? When will you finally understand this?" My hands were shaking with rage as I spoke, but Madison just grinned at me with obvious mockery. "Are you making money?" Her tone was laced with disdain. "Do you earn money from your hobby, which can't even be called a job? It's not real money, Samantha. You can't live on them." "I earn enough to cover all my expenses," I replied, feeling anger constrict my throat. "I covered all the repairs in this house from my own savings that I earned at my job. After my grandfather's death, when the house needed repairs, neither Mom nor Dad spent a cent. I paid for everything." I noticed how this statement slightly embarrassed Madison, but only for a moment. She shot me an appraising glance, and then, grinning, said, "Do you think you've done something great? That money belonged to Grandpa, not you. Or do you think I didn't know about his generosity?" I froze for a moment, stunned by her words. "Grandpa really gave me a bank book shortly before his death," I said, holding back my emotions. "He and Grandma saved this money for me. They knew that my parents would never really recognize me. They knew that I would have to cope on my own." I took a breath, continuing, "Because, unlike you, Madison, I have never been the center of their attention. This money is their concern for me, not for you." Madison was taken aback for a moment, but then her face twisted in disdain. "Do you think I didn't know? I found this bank book in your drawer and immediately realized that they were holding something from us. But where's the bank card, Samantha? You do realize that this was all our family, and not just your little secret, right? How could you be so petty and hide it?" These words pierced me, and I felt anger and resentment coming in a wave. She rummaged through my things, violated my personal space, found what should have been a sacred memory, something intimate that my grandfather left me in case my life was in danger one day. "How could you?" I whispered, feeling the trembling increase. "That's mean, Madison. How dare you go through my stuff?" She didn't flinch, her gaze was cold and resolute. "Is it mean?" she almost hissed. "It was mean of our grandparents to leave the money for you and neglect the rest. You're their granddaughter, but you're not the only one. How could they prefer you, putting all of us on the back burner? How could they so unceremoniously neglect our family, as if you alone meant something to them?" Her words burned me like a red-hot iron. I understood that behind all these accusations there was only envy and a sense of neglected right, but it was unbearable to hear them. My grandparents left me this money not because they wanted to harm others, but because they took care of me, saw how I suffered from a lack of warmth and attention in this family, saw how I was left alone with myself while others turned away. "It wasn't a slight on you," I said, not taking my eyes off her. "They knew you were always their pride, Madison. Your parents have always looked at you with admiration, and at me as a burden. And my grandparents understood this. They understood that I would need support. It suddenly became clear to me why my parents never mentioned the repair fee. They must have known from the very beginning about the bank book that my grandfather left me, and believed that it was my responsibility to cover all expenses. They took my grandfather's money for granted and assumed that any obligations were lifted from them, because they were sure that I would cope on my own. Or maybe they just didn't care how exactly I would do it. Madison continued her monologue, her voice dripping with confidence and slight contempt. I understand why Grandpa and Grandma left the money to you, she said, looking at me with barely concealed disapproval. They probably thought that you were unemployed and unable to be independent, and therefore needed support. Yes, now everything looks good here, updated appliances, cleanliness, and order. But why do you think that you are the only one who has the right to do this? I was about to object, and Madison suddenly stopped and assumed a cold, almost formal look. It was as if she was waiting for the moment to reveal her true intentions. Her lips curved into a satisfied grin, and a spark of self-satisfaction flashed in her eyes. Actually, she said, glancing at Dylan, who was sitting with a gloomy face, he's going to build a new hospital. It's a huge project, you know. She said it with pride, as if it was about some historical event. And as you know, there are almost no other hospitals nearby, so this is a great chance for Dylan. I stared at her, not understanding what she was getting at, and tried to catch the slightest hint of sympathy or understanding, but her expression remained cold. We're thinking of moving here, she said, looking me straight in the eye. This house will be a convenient base for us, because the new project will take up all of Dylan's time. We can use it as a convenient place to travel to a future hospital. And we need you to leave. You see, Samantha, you have to give up the house for the sake of the family, for Mom and Dad, because it would be better for them if our family lived here, wouldn't it? I felt my insides go cold. It was as if this house, which I considered my only refuge, was filled with other people's intentions, which drove me out of its walls. I know that the house is registered in your name, she continued, as if I owned only a minor formal right. But for the sake of all of us, you have to leave, Samantha. Just give it to me and we'll settle this peacefully. Of course, both Mom and Dad are on my side. Her voice was confident and firm. They also want you to leave this house. I felt Madison's words crashing down on me like hammer blows, and bitterness flared up inside me from each of them. I remembered how my grandfather had transferred the house to my name at the time, and at that moment I didn't realize why he did it. But now everything became clearer, as if the scales were falling from his eyes. He knew, foresaw that one day I would have to defend this place from the claims of others. This house is filled with memories of my grandparents, I said firmly, finally interrupting her. It's their gift to me, and I'm not leaving. Madison gave me a look full of contempt, as if I'd said something ridiculous. Stop acting like a child, Samantha, she said with undisguised irritation. You're just a parasite clinging to this place and making us all uncomfortable. Finally understand, it's time for you to leave. Madison continued to scream, striking what seemed to be the last blow, trying to crush my resistance and knock out the desire to stay in the house forever. Samantha, don't you realize that you're a bad influence on your nephew? She said, her voice full of contempt, as if every word was a final accusation. Your nephew. Madison let out a bitter smile, turning my feelings into a mockery. Do you really want him to see you as a parasite dependent on your parents? I looked at my mother, hoping to see at least the slightest support or understanding in her eyes. But she seemed to agree with every word Madison said. My father was sitting next to me, his face buried in the phone, clearly avoiding conflict, but his silence said more than any words. Dylan didn't say anything, but his face showed that he fully supported his wife. I was suddenly overwhelmed by a feeling of complete loneliness, as if I was among people who didn't care what happened to me at all. Internally, I told myself that their opinions did not matter to me. They didn't know anything about my real feelings and would never hear from me if I tried to explain myself. The only way out was to leave this place, this house, which had already ceased to be a safe haven for me. "Do whatever you want," I managed, and turned around and went to my room. I was furious, but I firmly decided that I would act coldly and rationally. At night, I made a final decision on what to do next. Morning came, and when I went downstairs, I saw that Madison's family had already left. The parents were still asleep, and the traces of last night remained untouched, like petrified witnesses to everything that happened. I grabbed my laptop, quietly left the house and headed to the nearest cafe. I needed the space to calmly think through every step. I just managed to sit down at a table and open my laptop, as the phone immediately began to burst with calls and messages from my mother. She demanded that I come home and cook breakfast for them. I ignored all her messages and calls, feeling only relief that I no longer had to follow their orders. Focusing on my laptop, I started looking for a transportation company. As soon as one of the offices opened, I managed to arrange an urgent visit with them. It was lucky that there was no high season, and they could come on the same day. I returned to the house when my parents were at work, in an empty and cold house, where the smell of the past evening still lingered, as if everything that happened remained within these walls. I took a deep breath, trying to contain my resentment, and started my plan. Just a couple of hours later, a truck stopped in front of the house and work began. The movers went about their business with professional precision. They carefully and quickly packed everything I had bought in recent years, starting with large household appliances, a washing machine, refrigerator, vacuum cleaner and microwave oven, everything that I had purchased. I followed their actions, realizing that these are not just things. These were my achievements. Each subject was as proof of my independence, which they never recognized. The movers carefully packed the dishes and all the little things with which I equipped the house. I watched them collect each item, trying not to think about what I was leaving behind. With each box taken out, the house became more and more empty, until finally only bare walls remained, almost like the first day when Grandma and Grandpa settled here. One by one, the lamps that I touched to dim the lights in the rooms to make them cozy were removed and packed. By the end of the day, it was all over. The house became empty, just as our relationship was empty. Only memories remained, which now seemed distant and painful. When I left the house that had filled my life with so many conflicting emotions, I felt strangely relieved. He was still legally mine, but now he was just an empty repository of memories that no longer brought comfort. When I closed the door behind me, I felt inside that I had finally freed myself from long years of heaviness and humiliation. Less than a couple of hours later, my phone vibrated. The mother's number appeared on the screen. I answered, and immediately I was assaulted by her indignant voice. "What the hell does that mean?" She growled. "Where is all the equipment? Did you take her away?" I kept calm and answered, "Of course. You wanted me to leave, so I'm leaving, but of course I'm taking everything I bought." "I'm glad you're finally leaving," she replied tartly, "but taking the equipment is too much. This is wrong." "And why should it be wrong? It's all mine. I bought everything with my own money." She snorted, as if she'd caught me in a lie. "You bought all this with your grandfather's money." I rolled my eyes, feeling disappointed at her insistence on not understanding. How many times have I tried to explain that I never spent the money left to me by my grandfather? These funds have always been something sacred to me, a memory of his care and support. To put an end to her accusations, I sent a photo of my bank book, which clearly showed the amount and the last withdrawal of funds. "Here, take a look for yourself," I added dryly. "Everything is on the balance sheet the same as it was. The only withdrawal is $100, and that won't change the point. I bought everything with my own money, and I took everything that belongs to me." There was a long silence, then I heard her strangled voice, which showed anger. "Good. We don't need your equipment. Madison and her family will help us with this if necessary." "Wonderful," I replied coldly. But don't forget that the house is in my name anyway. It's you who should leave." The last words I heard from my mother before she hung up the phone were filled with hatred and indignation. I silently hoped that Dylan would be able to buy a house for them, and not just household appliances. A few days later, unexpectedly, I received a call from Madison. Her voice sounded unusually soft, careful, as if she was searching for the right words. "Samantha, I hope you've calmed down already. Can we talk again? You are welcome." Her tone was so unusual that I felt a little surprised. I remained calm, but I kept my guard up. "What do you want to talk about?" I replied, trying to sound cold. "I'm busy at work, so hurry up." "I thought about it a lot," she began, sounding humble. "It was probably our mistake to try to kick you out. We're a family, and shouldn't a family stick together?" I snorted, unable to help myself. Her words seemed painfully ironic. "After you called me a parasite, now you're suddenly talking about family?" I could barely contain my sarcasm. "No, Madison, absolutely not. You've already moved in, haven't you?" "Yes," she replied after a short pause, clearly confused. "We moved in yesterday, but there were some difficulties." "Difficulties? Oh, is it really, Dylan?" Judging by her silence, I hit the nail on the head. "He was fired from the hospital," she admitted reluctantly, her voice barely audible. "I don't understand how you could know about this." "Madison, I'm not as ignorant as you seem to think." "You know, Madison," I began coldly, barely suppressing a bitter smile, "I have a friend who works as an administrator at the hospital where Dylan worked." She told me why he was actually fired. Madison froze, and I continued, not hiding the sarcasm in my voice. "It turns out that Dylan had an affair with one of the nurses. And not just a novel. He got her pregnant, and he tried to force her to give up the baby to hide it all. But she apparently did not agree and, in a rage, spread the whole truth around the hospital. Can you imagine the scandal? His father was forced to fire his own son in order not to spoil the reputation of the hospital. And so your new hospital project turned out to be just a beautiful lie invented by Dylan to somehow get out in front of you and stay in the house. And even then, not for long. A lawsuit has already been filed against Dylan. The husband of this nurse is demanding compensation." Madison sighed heavily. Her silence seemed to envelop her as tightly as this sudden realization of collapse. "Dylan doesn't have any money," she said softly, as if she had finally recognized the reality she had been hiding from for so long. "And now, and Dad's. He left home." I asked, trying to remain indifferent, although my heart was squeezed by an unpleasant premonition. Madison forced out a bitter laugh. "Yes. It turned out that he was having an affair too. He left my mom a note complaining about her, attaching the divorce papers to it, and just left, just before we were supposed to move into the house." The words hung in the silence, cold and heavy as a winter matinee. I tried to imagine the scene, Dad leaving everything behind, and Mom, who just silently went to bed instead of somehow coping with it. And now Madison, as if remembering something, added in a voice of despair, "You're not going to leave us in this position, are you, Samantha? You still have the money that Grandpa left you. Can you help us?" I felt my heart clench with bitterness. All this time, they despised my efforts, did not believe in my work, and devalued all my achievements. And now that their own hopes had been dashed, they suddenly decided to remember my grandfather's money, my ability to work, and finally to address me as their last hope. How easy it was for them to ignore me until I was needed. "Madison, what are you even saying?" I asked coldly, not trying to hide my anger. "The irony is that all these years you and Mom have only mocked how I earn. And now that it's convenient for you, have you decided to ask me for help? You didn't even imagine that I could feed myself with my own earnings, but suddenly, when you need it, everything changed." Samantha, please, she murmured, her voice low and trembling, but there was no true remorse in it, only despair. You're not going to leave us like this, are you? I listened in silence, feeling anger and resentment fill my heart again. All their claims, all their humiliations, contemptuous ridicule, and attempts to expel me from the house suddenly became completely insignificant in front of one simple truth. They saw in me only a means, a temporary support that can be used and thrown away when it is no longer needed. No, Madison, I said firmly, feeling the same strength that I always lacked to put myself in my place. I'm not coming back. All these years, I endured neglect, insults, and rejection for the sake of one thing, for the sake of a house in which memories of my grandparents were preserved, where every corner kept the warmth of their care and love. But now I realize that the real memories will always remain with me, in my heart. This house ceased to be a refuge, becoming only a stage for family dramas in which I no longer played a role. The words came out of my mouth on their own, leaving behind a liberating feeling. Understand, I have no good memories associated with you, with Dad or Mom. Your requests and pleas now only cause irritation. And don't forget, I want you to vacate the house. In the near future, it will officially become mine. As I said these words, I felt my heart lighten, as if the shackles that bound me had finally broken. I knew that I could find my happiness, even if I had to start all over again, far from what was once home. Madison tried to touch me again. Please, Samantha, will you really leave your family? Will you just walk away and leave us? But it didn't matter to me anymore. I didn't answer her calls and texts, and every day the feeling of freedom only grew stronger. For the first 3 months they tried to contact me, but soon despair and humility got the better of them, and they finally left me alone. My days became peaceful and filled with new joy, as if after many years of calm I had found meaning and peace in a simple and independent life. Later, I heard that Madison and Dylan had opened their hospital after all, taking out a large loan for it. But, as it turned out, their hopes were in vain. The nurse Dylan was having an affair with continued to spread bad rumors, and the hospital's reputation did not improve. My mother, who had suffered the shock of my father's departure, fell into a deep depression and was now being treated in the hospital. I already perceived all this news as something far away, as shadows of the past that could no longer touch my life. When I finally decided to move, I realized that I had to put an end to the story of this house. I put it up for sale, and soon the deal was completed. Madison and her family, burdened with debts and deprived of support, were forced to move into a small rented apartment, where they lived without the former luxury and were forced to take into account new circumstances. Now their lives were no longer my concern, and although I did not feel sorry for their fate, I sincerely hoped that my nephew would one day find real happiness. He was innocent of all this and deserved better than the problems he was involved in. And I, finally free, devoted myself to work. My business was booming, and thanks to the wisdom and patience that my grandparents gave me, I began to expand it, opening up new horizons and opportunities. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was really living and not just existing. Looking back, I realized that all this was made possible by those who sincerely believed in me. And now, finally, I have a goal: to find a home that will truly be mine, which I can fill with new memories and to which I will return with joy. I knew that the past no longer dictated my future, and I was determined to continue on my way, giving myself completely to a life in which there was a place for both happiness and real peace.